YouTube. In the previous video of my Biblical Critique series, I looked at the story of Abraham before the birth of his son Isaac, and I attempted to explain the origin of the Israelites from an archaeological perspective. Now I'll delve into the story of Isaac, which isn't nearly as long as either Abraham's or Jacob's stories, only about 7 chapters. So, let's continue. Yahweh finally allows Sarah to become pregnant, and she gives birth to Isaac. Ishmael, Hagar's young son that she had with Abraham, laughs at Isaac and pokes fun, so both Hagar and Ishmael get sent away with only some bread and a bottle of water for a child support payment. Abraham concludes a covenant with Abimelech and calls the place where he makes the covenant Beersheba. After that, Yahweh tells Abraham to sacrifice his only son on a mountaintop. Abraham just goes along with it, and at the very last minute, Yahweh sends his angel to tell Abraham to not sacrifice his son after all. Not being one to waste an opportunity to burn something, Abraham sacrifices a ram instead of his son. I feel like this part of the story is less an emotional retelling of a personal event and more religious and political in nature. The reason why I feel that way is that in later books, the authors criticize the Canaanites very severely, and one of their criticisms that they use over and over again is that the Canaanites sacrificed their children to their gods. It seems to me like the author is trying to make a commentary on the Canaanite religious practices by differentiating between them and the Israelite religions, and also pointing out how the Israelite religion is better. Abraham is clearly devoted to Yahweh, which is shown by his willingness to commit such a bloody act because his God told him to do it. So it seems as though the authors are admitting the Canaanite believers who were willing to sacrifice their children to their gods were also very faithful and devoted, but to the wrong things, according to the Bible. Because Yahweh, the so-called true God, would never allow a child to actually be sacrificed to him, except that he actually did allow it. After the sacrifice of the ram, Yahweh once more makes the covenant to multiply Abraham's seed. Sarah dies in Hebron, and Abraham arranges to buy a burial plot for her. Soon thereafter, Abraham sends his manservant to the city of Nahor to get a woman for his son Isaac to marry. The servant meets up with Rebekah, who is the daughter of Isaac's cousin. She is described as being very attractive in appearance, and she is, quote, a virgin, and no man had had intercourse with her, according to Genesis chapter 24, verse 16. I know there's quite a bit of repetition in the Bible, but I thought this bit of repetition was interesting, and I wanted to briefly share my ideas on it here. I've heard that the word virgin used to mean something different in the ancient world than what it means today. The word virgin used to simply mean a woman who is unattached to a man, basically single, and that seems to fit the context of the statement that they make about Rebekah here. So Rebekah is given lots of jewelry and agrees to go with the manservant to the land where Abraham and Isaac live. Isaac sees Rebekah and has sex with her in his mother's tent, which is kinda kinky. Abraham takes another wife and has a few more children before he dies. Isaac prays for his wife Rebekah to become pregnant, and she does, with twins who struggle with one another in the womb. The firstborn twin is Esau, and the second twin is named Jacob. Almost right away, Jacob seems to be a bastard towards his older brother and convinces him to give Jacob his birthright as firstborn for some food and drink, whereas Esau seems to be a pushover and just basically accepts Jacob's proposition. Isaac and his wife are apparently forced to go to Abimelech and pull the same wool over his eyes that Isaac's father did years ago. Yahweh even cautions Isaac not to go down into Egypt for some reason, even though a generation earlier and a generation later it was perfectly okay to go down into Egypt. Abimelech once again allows himself to be taken in by the same ruse formerly used by Abraham until he catches Isaac having a good time with Rebekah. And Abimelech is also lenient towards Isaac and allows him to stay in the land and cultivate it until the Philistines, who, as I mentioned in my previous video, were not even supposed to be in the land until around 1200 BC. The Philistines get jealous and quarrel with Isaac and his men over the wells in the area. Isaac gets to Beersheba, and Yahweh appears to him and proceeds to bless him and promises to multiply his seed. Isaac feasts with Abimelech and finds another well. He calls this well Sheba, and the author explains that, quote, "This is why the name of the city is Beersheba down to this day," end quote. Even though Abraham had previously given this place its name in Genesis chapter 21, verse 31, because Abraham had made a covenant with Abimelech at that time, and that was supposed to be why the place was called Beersheba. Esau grows up and falls in love with 2 Hittite women, but Isaac and Rebekah are bitter about this. I think this reflects the later author's prejudice against foreign women. Next, Isaac requests Esau hunt down some game for Isaac to eat so that Esau can have a blessing before Isaac dies. Rebekah convinces Jacob, who seems a little hesitant to take his brother's blessing when he was so willing earlier to take his birthright, to dress up as Esau and present Isaac with a meal so that Isaac will give Jacob the blessing meant for Esau. The ruse is quite successful, but Esau seeks revenge. Rebekah convinces Isaac, who doesn't seem to need much convincing in anything his wife says, to send Jacob away for a while so he can find a wife among their relatives. After this, the Genesis narrative pretty much becomes Jacob's story. Furthermore, most of Isaac's story seems to be merely a midpoint between Abraham's and Jacob's stories, and even the parts that don't mention Abraham, like Isaac's meeting up with Abimelech, sound very similar to Abraham's story anyway. Also, some scholars, like Martin Noth, have pointed to the locations of the patriarchs as a clue to their origins. Abraham is presented as the oldest patriarch and mostly resides in the middle part of Canaan, near major Judahite cities like Bethel, Salem or Jerusalem, and Hebron. The second patriarch, Isaac, is also primarily depicted as living in the south of the region around Beersheba, Beer-Hai-Roi, and Gerar. Only the last patriarch, Jacob, is portrayed as living primarily in the northern part of Canaan, what would be later known as the Kingdom of Israel. Scholars like Noth believe that this points to a Judahite author emphasizing the primacy of the Kingdom of Judah over the Kingdom of Israel. He stated that these patriarchs may have arisen separately, and it was only a later author that combined these patriarch stories into a continuous narrative. It is possible that the author's bias could have affected the order in which the stories were arranged. It may well be that the actual order of the stories could have been different. Perhaps Abraham's story occurred after Jacob's story and not before it. In Jacob's story, it's mentioned he named the city of Bethel not once but twice, whereas in Abraham's narrative, Abraham sets up an altar at a place already called Bethel. Also, the nature of the patriarchs themselves seem to support the scholars' conclusions that these stories were compiled by a Judahite author. Abraham and Isaac, who tend to reside primarily in the southern highlands of Judah, tend to come across as devoted and loyal, and even in instances when they do lie, it appears quite justified. Whereas Jacob, who mainly resides in the northern lowlands, seems to lie and cheat from an early time in his life, seemingly because he can. Abraham and Isaac seem to be very trusting in God also, Abraham especially, to the point where he is willing to sacrifice Isaac. Jacob is never asked to make any such sacrifices. If anything, he seems to test and struggle with God more than Abraham or Isaac ever did. In the next 2 videos, I will wrap up my analysis of the book of Genesis by looking at Jacob's and Joseph's stories respectively. Peace and blessings, and have a nice day.